History is filled with kings who maintained large harems of women designated as their mistresses and concubines. Some of these women were also known to be good performers. Some were artistic, some were witty, and some were known for their sheer beauty. But their most important duty was to share their king's bed. Madame de Pompadour, however, wasn't content with the bed. She also shared the authority with King Louis XV.
Welcome to Nutty History. Today we're looking back at the filthy secrets that Madame de Pompadour had as the mistress of France. The most gorgeous woman in France. Summer was beginning and the year was 1745. An Italian comedy troupe was performing in the Palace Theater of Versailles, and the king and queen were seated there in two boxes, one above the other. The box opposite the king was reserved for a charming woman who was making her first public appearance in Versailles. The audience that night could swear that the king had his eyes fixated on the box in front of him instead of watching the play. A guest at the event, the Duke of Luynes, also confessed that a charming woman named Jeannette Poisson d'Etude was extremely pretty and well-dressed. Surprise, surprise, she was the one sitting in front of the king. She had a stunning figure and an even more attractive face. There was something about her that made it hard for people to look away from her. Her blonde hair, her blue eyes, her alabaster skin, those rosy cheeks had immediately entranced King Louis XV.
But beauty tends to be ephemeral unless you are Dame Helen Mirren or Monica Bellucci. The king, being the king, always had younger options down the years. So how come Jeannette kept the king interested in her for 20 long years?
It wasn't just looks. She was also whip smart to keep the king wrapped around her fingers. She was educated at Ursuline Convent, which was considered the best school for girls in France back then. Even though she lasted there for only 4 years thanks to a bout with whooping cough, the education was certainly not wasted on her. She managed to impress the philosopher Voltaire with her wits and knowledge. In his words, he had never seen someone who had read so much. That night after the Italian comedy performance, Jeannette was invited to have supper with the king himself. When Jeannette entered the dining room, she saw the king's two closest friends sitting around the table, the Duke of Ayen and the Count of Corny.
To her surprise, the queen wasn't present for this intimate dinner. A small smirk appeared on her face, knowing that she was accepted. The king was interested in her, of course. Soon she began to appear at small supper parties given by the king to his intimate circle. This was a seal of approval, not from just the king, but his friends and well-wishers too. Everybody had accepted that the king and Jeannette were smitten with each other, and so they had given their blessings.
She overcame fierce competition. Let's move back a little to the beginning. Becoming the king's mistress wasn't easy. Jeannette crossed the king's caravan several times when the king visited her husband's estate for a hunting expedition in 1744 to get some attention from him. She also wore different attire and colors every time, hoping one of them would make the king turn and look. Though there was no immediate reaction from the sovereign, that desperate attempt wasn't a total waste either. A year later, she got an invitation that would change her life forever. She was asked to attend the mass ball at the Palace of Versailles, celebrating the wedding of Dauphin Louis to Maria Theresa of Spain. But when Jeannette arrived, she was surprised to find out that the main event of the ball was in fact her. The king and several courtiers were dressed in identical yew tree costumes to avoid the prying eyes, thus allowing the king to enjoy every little element of the event without being bothered. Jeannette's costume was a beautiful piece and a saucy one. She had cleverly dressed as a Roman deity Diana, the goddess of the hunt. Surely it was an attempt to draw the king's attention and memory both toward her.
Later, before the ball came to an end, the king took off his incognito mask to not only reveal himself in front of her, but also to publicly declare how much he was in love with Jeannette. However, the road to this accomplishment wasn't easy for Jeannette. When she began working on earning the king's heart, the path wasn't a straight one. The king's bed was already occupied by some competition named Marie-Anne de Mailly, Madame de Châteauroux.
Unlike Jeannette, Marie-Anne was a widow, so it was a much less complicated matter for the king to have her as a mistress. Also, Marie-Anne had snatched the coveted title of the king's mistress from none other than her own sister, Louise Julie. I'm guessing those family gatherings were awkward and really tense in the de Mailly house, but for Marie-Anne, it was worth it. She was ambitious and pragmatic. The king was besotted. So Marie-Anne had secured herself a salary, influence, and a title, the Duchess of Châteauroux. Her ambitious personality had earned her quite a lot of envy and rivals at the king's court. When Jeanette tried to compete for the king's attention in the summer of 1744, Marie Anne was all the king could think of, and her influence was vast over the French royal court. The road to the king's apartment in Versailles was extremely tough for Jeanette. A twist and a half. Weeks later, when Louis XV ventured to the frontier at Metz with his court, Marie Anne followed the king to the military camp. She would have stayed by his side if the king wouldn't have fallen gravely ill. Back then, being the king's mistress was the most coveted job for women in France, but it also had a stigma attached to it. Religious rites demanded that the mistresses be sent away so the king could be absolved of his sins on his deathbed. Marie Anne begrudgingly returned to Paris after the king renounced her. But in September, to everyone's surprise, the king recovered and rallied back to Versailles and asked Marie Anne once more to become his mistress.
This was a huge setback for Jeanette's efforts to acquire the most sought-after position. Interestingly, she wasn't the only one who was disappointed by Marie Anne's return. A lot of courtiers had grown envious and tired of Madame de Charteauroux's bossy attitude, and now the king was breaking the protocol for her. This shocking scandal meant more power and influence for Marie Anne.
Madame de Charteauroux was not only thrilled but vying for vengeance against those who had humiliated her in Metz after the king fell ill, those who tried to stop the king from recalling her, and those who posed obstacles in her path of return. In her letter to the Duke of Richelieu, Marie Anne mentioned that her return would be the most brilliant thing that happened in Versailles. She was about to become the most powerful woman in French history. But as it happens, in all good dramas, this story has one final twist.
3 months after her return to Versailles, on a chilly morning in early December, when Madame Charteauroux showed up at Versailles, the hallways of the Grand Palace echoed her blood-curdling screams. She was hunched over, her knees grabbing her stomach, suffering from an excruciating amount of pain. Only a few days later, the woman who was on her path to become the pseudo-ruler of France was suddenly dead.
A lot of historians have hypothesized that she was perhaps a victim of peritonitis, but given the circumstances and the affair of poison that embroiled King Louis's term as a king decades later, poisoning could have been a possibility. There were a lot of career casualties when Marie Anne sought repercussions for how certain courtiers treated her during the king's illness. This vendetta had only increased her enemies in Versailles. The affair was full of secrets.
It didn't take Jeanette Poisson-Guétule long to become the new mistress after the king publicly announced his feelings for her at the mass ball. Following the footsteps of her predecessor, she became the marquise of the estate called Pompadour and went one step ahead of Madame Charteauroux to get her brother the title of nobility as well.
She also claimed the apartment in Versailles that belonged to Marie Anne. The apartment was right above the king's own chambers, and it had a secret staircase connecting the two apartments in case anyone was confused about her reason for being there. Soon, the rumors of the romantic adventures of the king and his new mistress were beginning to become a favorite topic of everybody, from courtiers and staff of Versailles to the common masses on the streets of Paris. It is believed that Madame de Pompadour's humble beginnings helped her to connect with the king, who was fascinated with poor living in his capital. The two would often disguise themselves and sneak off to numerous little chalets in the countryside and pretend to be a poor couple. They would go hunt, enjoy nature hikes, and eat what the lower-class citizens would eat. That said, it is also true that all the rustic jugs and bowls in their humble abode were actually made of incredibly expensive materials. It is believed that the two lovers also spiced up their bedroom antics with theatrics and played pretend as well. Their closeness was beginning to bother a lot of courtiers, just like what happened with Madame de Charteauroux. Her haters tried to stoke the flame of gossip that King Louis XV wasn't actually in love with his new mistress, but was only too weak to get out of between her legs. But was only too weak to get out of his lust for her. Now, they were not entirely wrong. The king definitely could not have enough of her. He was so enchanted by her physique that when the man designed the famous champagne coupe glass, he confessed that he was inspired by the shape of his mistress's bosom. But their intimacy was not purely physical. King Louis XV was a troubled man. His mental wellness wasn't at best, and he was prone to intense melancholy and depressive moods. In such times, Madame de Pompadour was always ready to gather the pieces and care for the king and put him back together. She was also quite devoted to him, it seems.
Of course, her adversaries portrayed her as a power-hungry woman who was nursing the king during his melancholy to gain more influence over him. It's hard to judge from the outside, But Madame de Pompadour did become the most influential woman in all of France back then.
Most important woman in France. The meteoric rise of Madame de Pompadour was a bother for more than envious courtiers. 5 years after she moved to Versailles, the public was beginning to get irritated by the king slipping up regularly on his duties, and they were blaming Jeanette, aka Madame de Pompadour, for being too distracting. The religious section of the masses wanted him to clean up his act, get rid of the sinful mistress, and fulfill his duties as a pious Christian ruler.
Even the king's legitimate children hated Madame de Pompadour's guts. They were pretty vocal from the day she moved into the palace, and they never skipped a chance to let her know how much they really despised her. They called her names that we can't even say on YouTube.
But one person that you expect to really not like her became Jeanette's best pal in the palace, the queen herself. They were cordial with each other at least, and cooperated to keep their relationships healthy with the king and their places secure in the palace. Queen Marie even appointed Madame de Pompadour as her lady-in-waiting. Jeanette used her influence over the king to make him pay off Queen Marie's significant gambling debts and have him order a lavish makeover for the queen's apartment in Versailles. She also coyly regifted the queen a golden snuff box that the king had gifted to Jeanette. Apparently, the queen was so impressed by Madame de Pompadour's sucking up to her that she proclaimed if there must be a mistress, it's better to have Jeanette than any other.
Madame de Pompadour now had both regents under her charm, and she gained so much sway that she was France's de facto prime minister at the apex of her influence. It didn't work for the best in the dynasty and France's interest, though.
She could be held responsible for being unofficially in charge during France's failure in the 7 Years' War and for running court debts. Her disastrous consultation also sowed the seeds of the revolution that would end the Bourbon dynasty a generation later. But what about her husband? Unfortunately, Jeanette's real father was convicted of a defaulting debt and banished from France when she was only 4. Before anyone could blink, Charles Francois Paul Lenormand de Tounham, the royal tax collector, found a place in the Poisson family and became the legal guardian of little Jeanette. The word on the street was that Tounham was in fact the biological father of Jeanette, and Jeanette's mother's act around Tounham only stoked a fire of gossip.
When Jeanette was of an appropriate age for marriage, Tounham was the one responsible for finding her an appropriate suitor. It was his nephew, Charles Guillaume Lenormand de Tulle. He was a handsome young financier, and he had a major crush on the beautiful Jeanette, and to his delight, Tounham sweetened the deal by making him the sole heir of his immense wealth, removing every niece and nephew from his inheritance. And I'm sure they loved that.
The young couple were in love with each other for a while, and things definitely looked rosy from the outside. But Charles was always a second prize for the ambitious Jeanette. In her own words, she would never leave Charles unless for the king. Jeanette's mother was training her for one purpose only, to steal the king's attention. Even Charles' uncle Tounham was fully involved in the scheme. Jeanette was living in elite French salons, and Charles did not have a slight clue of his wife's true intentions for hosting grand socializing events. He fully supported her, and his love for her never wavered, even when their kids passed away at very young ages. Now, when Jeanette made her move on the king, Charles was out of the country, and by the time he got back, his wife had moved to Versailles. When he got the news on his return, he collapsed on the floor, clutching his heart.
To further shock, his own guardian, Uncle Tounham, asked him to be quiet and told him that Jeanette had become Madame de Pompadour with his blessings. Betrayed and heartbroken, Charles harbored animosity for his wife for almost his entire life. The king tried to offer him an olive branch by appointing him as the French ambassador to Turkey, but Charles dared to say no to the king in his royal court and told him they would not get rid of him by sending him away that easily.
Charles made sure everyone heard his side of the story and went on to have several affairs of his own as a way to get back at his wife, as if she cared. In time, he got the happy ending he wanted when he settled down with a famous dancer. Tell us in the comments if you would like to know more about the mistresses who impacted history most prolifically. And as always, thanks for watching Nutty History. And please do like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video for more.